Hi everyone! In this video, I'm going to show you how to use multiple authentication schemes in .NET. I will combine two JWT or JsonWebToken schemes and one cookie scheme to show you how multiple authentication schemes can be implemented inside the Web API project. Of course, there are a lot of use cases for combining multiple schemes, so let's start. To demonstrate how multiple schemes can work together, I will implement an API that uses a cookie-based authentication with the default scheme and two JWT barrier authentications with two different schemes. So, with the project prepared, let's navigate to the program class. Let's use the add authentication method to register authentication services, and for the cookie authentication, I will call the add cookie method that adds the cookie authentication with the default scheme. Also, I want to set what will happen if the user is redirected to the sign-in URI. And for that, I will set the response status code to 401 and return task completed task. Then, for the first JWT scheme, I will use the add JWT barrier method, which uses the default JWT scheme, and add some configuration with the help of the options parameter. I will use it to populate the token validation parameters property with a new instance of the token validation parameters class, and let's simply add all the necessary properties inside. Now, I won't dive into the JWT validation logic here because I already have a video on JWT authentication, and if you want to learn more about it, feel free to watch the video. The link is in the description below. Now, for the second JWT barrier, I will simply paste the code here as it is almost the same, except the scheme name, issue property, and the secret field value. Of course, for this, I need a JWT barrier package, which I already have installed. Also, to use the authentication services in our application, I have to add authentication to the request pipeline. Now, I need some endpoints that will use different schemes later in the video. So, I already have 3 controllers prepared. Let's check the Auth controller first. As you can see, I have 3 simple actions here, and each one will be used for the separate authentication scheme, as you can see by each route. Also, you can see I'm using a custom authentication service here, where I validate the tokens received from the requests, and also create a claims principal for the cookie authentication. The logic inside the service is not that important for the topic of the video, because I'm pretty sure you already know how JWT or cookie authentication works in .NET apps. Of course, there is a source code available if you want help with that as well. Now, after the Auth controller implementation, let's check the JWT controller. At this moment, I allow anyone to access endpoints, but later on in the video, I will use authorization with different authentication schemes for these endpoints. Finally, let's check the cookie controller. The idea for the cookie controller is to later authorize only cookie-based requests. Now that I have all examples endpoints in place, let's add authorization that will authorize against all 3 authentication schemes simultaneously. Since I want this endpoint to work with any scheme, let's first decorate it with the authorize attribute. If we use the authorize attribute without any parameters, it is going to use the default authorization policy. Since I have 3 different authentication schemes, let's make them all a default authorization policy in the program class. So, I will use the add authorization method to add a new authorization policy, and use the action delegate parameter to set some configuration. First, I need a default policy builder. And for that, I will instantiate a new authorization policy builder class and provide a default authentication scheme name for JWT authentication. then a default cookie authentication scheme name, and finally a custom scheme name for the second JOT policy. The first two names are built-in constants, as you can see, and the third one is my custom constant, so I don't have to type the name all the time. Also, I need to set a default policy. And for that, I will use my prepared policy builder, require an authenticated user, and build the authorization policy. Great, that's all I need to do to make all three schemes a default policy. So let's test this. As you can see, I already have several requests prepared. 3 post ones for the user authentication, the first and the second are the JOT requests, and the third one is the cookie request. You also see the body prepared for each post request. So let's send the first one, and I get the token. Let's do the same for the second one, and the token is here as well. Finally, let's send the last post request, and the cookie is here, and Postman saves it for future requests. Now that I have tokens and the cookie, let's send a few GET requests to the GetWithAny endpoint. Since the cookie is already saved, let's use it first. You can see the response we get here, and it is obviously from the cookie authentication. Now let's remove the cookie, take the token from the first request, and add it here as a bearer token. Okay, now I can send this request, and you see the response. The default JOT scheme is used. Finally, let's use the token from the second request, paste it here, and send the request. And as you can see, the response is pretty self-explanatory. Excellent. We have an endpoint that works with both tokens and a cookie. But what if we want to specify that the GetWithSecondJot endpoint only accepts second JOT scheme? Along with that, I wish that GetWithCookie only works with the cookie authentication scheme. Of course, with all of that, I need the GetWithAny to continue to work as before. Well, let's see multiple ways to achieve this. First, I will use an authorization policy to work with one authentication scheme. For that, I will add 2 policies in the program class just below the default configured policy. So, I will use the options.addPolicy method to add a new policy with a policy name for the first argument, and a new authorization policy builder class that accepts the required scheme name. And of course, as I already did, I will require authenticated user and build the policy. Now, let's do a similar thing for the second policy. Just this time, I'm using a different policy name and a default name for the cookie authentication scheme. You can also see here my custom policy and scheme name constants. This configuration allows me to specify the policy in the Authorize attribute. And since I want GetWithSecondJot to work only with second JOT scheme, let's use the Authorize attribute and inside add the name of my second JOT policy. Also, let's add the cookie policy to the GetWithCookie endpoint with the Authorize attribute and the name of the cookie policy. Great. Now let's run the app and test this. Now, if I use the first token inside the GetWithSecondJot request and send that request, I get a 401 status code as a response. Yet, with the second token, and let's paste it here, I get the expected response. Also, if I use the same token with the cookie request, while the cookie is not saved, I get 401. But if I use the cookie again, I get the correct response. this works excellent. And now let's achieve the same behavior by specifying the authentication scheme and not the policy in the authorize attribute. To do that, first I need to change the authorize attribute on this endpoint. I will hide the policy here and use the authorize attribute again, but this time with the authentication schemes property set to new scheme name. After that, I have to add a few changes in the add authentication method inside the program class. I will extend this method with the options parameter and use it to set the default scheme name to the required name from one of my constants. I will do the same for the default challenge scheme property with the same constant. Now, the second thing I have to do is to add a new authentication handler below the second JWT barrier scheme. For that, I will use the add policy scheme method, which accepts the name of the policy first, then the display name, and an action delegate that I can use to configure this scheme. So, with the help of the options parameter, I will call the forward default selector property, which selects a default scheme for the current request forwarded by the authentication handler, and I also need a context parameter here. Now I need the authorization header name, and I can use the context request.headers property and extract the name of the authorization header. Of course, I have to check if it's not null or an empty string, and also if the header starts with the bearer part, as all JWT bearer headers do. If that's the case, I can simply extract the token without the bearer part and use a new JWT handler to check if the token is well formed with the canRead token method. And if it is, I will return a default JWT scheme if the issuer is a localhost 7208 or the second scheme if it's not. On the other hand, I will simply use the default cookie scheme. Of course, if we go even deeper into this logic, I could add a few more checks here and there, but you get the point from the code as is. Now, the last thing I have to do is hide the default policy part in the add authorization call. Awesome. Since I applied the authentication scheme only to the second JWT endpoint, I can test this case. Let's run the app and, for example, use the first token inside the second JWT request. And as you can see, I get 401. But if I use the appropriate token, I get the correct response. Finally, if I want to use the same authentication scheme in the cookie controller, I can hide this policy and use a new authentication scheme. Of course, with proper scheme name that I already set in my multiple scheme registration in the program class. Great. If I test this with previous cases, I would get the same results for sure. So, you've seen how you can use multiple authentication schemes in your Web API project. And with that, I can finish the video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next one. Until then, all the best.